Unit 1, Part 4. In this part, we'll review what makes human speech, language, and communication so special. Part 4 corresponds with slides 56 to 75. Let's review first the definitions of language that I introduced you to in Part 3. Our review of these definitions will highlight again the what and the how of language development. This slide describes the what of language development, that is, what the child needs to acquire and what we'll be studying later in the course in terms of the milestones. Let's compare Hewlett's definition with ASHA's definition. So in item 1, both Hewlett and ASHA describe language as a symbol system. Remember that the symbols of a language are its speech sounds or phonemes and its words. So for example, the letter B is a symbol for the B sound, and the word dog is a symbol or representation of the actual animal, and the word God is a representation of a concept that we have in our thoughts, in our thinking. So again, language is symbolic in nature. In item 2, both definitions describe language as rule-governed, and ASHA's definition describes the 5 rule systems for us: phonologic, morphologic, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. So what does the child need to acquire? The symbols and the rules of his language. This slide describes the how of language development, that is, how does language happen for the child? As we'll see in Unit 2, when we discuss the theories of language development in weeks 3 and 4, that language learning is a multifaceted process that needs the interaction of our biology, our cognitive development, as well as the environment. And we'll talk more about the how of language development in Unit 2. This slide now reviews 3 additional details included in ASHA's very comprehensive definition, and I've included my explanations in blue. So, in item 4, we're reminded of the interrelationship between our thoughts, language, speech, and communication. In item 5, we're reminded that languages evolve and change based on the needs of the language community. And in item 6, we're reminded that to be an effective communicator, that is, to have communicative competence, which we'll be talking about later in parts 5 and 6, we need to understand the specific environment so that we're culturally sensitive to non-linguistic cues and also sensitive to our partner's culture and to his role in society. So this is a reminder for us that we need to be culturally sensitive in our communications. And again, we'll return to a fuller definition of communicative competence in parts 5 and 6. So now moving forward, we've already talked about and defined communication, and we know that animals communicate. You remember the messages that Dora communicates and how she does it? But we also know that human communication and language and speech is very special. We know that there are special, unique characteristics of human speech and language and communication that again make it special and that distinguishes it from animal communication. And when these characteristics are considered all together, they really highlight how special human speech, language, and communication is, how unique and how different it is from animal communication. And these characteristics also highlight for us why our communication can be so sophisticated and so complex. So I'd like to now take a look at some of these unique characteristics or features of human speech, language, and communication. They're described on pages 8 to 21 in our book and in table 1.2 on page 10. I'm not talking about all of them. I've just identified 9 special characteristics that we'll review together, which are semanticity and indexicality, displacement, productivity, recursion, prevarication, reflexivity, learnability, and traditional transmission. So let's begin with semanticity. What is it? This is what it is. Because we have very large vocabularies of words that represent or are symbols for people and objects and concepts in our environment. When we communicate, we can use those words to be very precise and specific with our meanings. Indexicality. What is it? The meaning of human communication can be even further shaded or specified for more detail by our ability to use and interpret cues from the social context. So the question is, how do we do it? And there are 3 ways that are described that are coming up. One way is that we use our background knowledge to help interpret the meaning of words that are used in a specific social context. And there's a great example on page 14. It's under It's Time to Play, and I'd like to highlight that for you on page 14. An example for indexicality. Consider, for example, a 3rd grade teacher who is discussing the band instruments she's given to each student. The teacher says, "It's time to play." And we know that that could have 2 different meanings, right? The students know, though, that it's time to play their instruments, not time to break for recess. The interpretation of the utterance depended not just on the words produced, but also on the human ability to use the context and knowledge of phrasal stress to help establish meaning. Okay. A second way is that we can analyze messages to determine their truthfulness, reality, and completeness. There's another good example of this on page 15 under It's Raining. So I'm on page 15, the top. Perconti 2002 uses the example of It's Raining to show how this aspect of human speech works. In this simple sentence, the verb is signals the dimension of time, but there's nothing in the sentence to indicate the place or the location. The receiver, however, using contextual information, determines the place in order to establish whether or not the statement is true. And a third way that we have the characteristic of indexicality is that we understand the gestalt or the essence of the social context by considering the language combined with the paralinguistic cues and the non-linguistic cues, and all that information helps us make judgments regarding the speaker's state of mind. So, for example, is the speaker happy or scared or nervous? So there's actually, again, a great example of this on page 15, the middle of the page. And here's the example. If you're at a party with your best friend and something unpleasant happens to her, you can determine quickly and with a fair degree of accuracy what happened to upset her. How do you assess the situation? Here we go, some paralinguistic cues. You listen to her words, those are language cues, but then you also take into account the paralinguistic cues. Her voice, including the stress and intonation. You react to the rhythm of her projections, pitch fluctuations, and rate variations. Taken together, all this information helps you determine her state of mind. And then coming to the final sentence of that paragraph, there is no doubt, however, that human communications are far more sophisticated, far more detailed and specific than those of other animals in terms of using context to interpret the social and psychological factors that help make messages complete and meaning rich for both the sender and the listener. So just as an aside, and so you know, these three examples that we just reviewed, being able to use background knowledge to determine the meaning of language, being able to analyze messages based on what's going on in the context, being able to listen to language and paralinguistic and non-linguistic cues and take into consideration the social cues, all that really highlight characteristics of being a competent communicator. Our goal is to take in as much information as we can so that we can understand exactly what's being communicated. Again, the concept of being a competent communicator or communicative competence is something that we'll be talking about very soon. Okay, so here's another characteristic that makes human language so special, and this is displacement. We know that phonemes and words are symbols and that they represent objects and people in the environment. By being able to understand and have these symbols in your head to be able to use them, we're not bound to talk about only the things in our immediate sight right in front of us. Because we can because we're using the symbols of language, we can talk about things that are displaced or removed in time and location. So this allows us to talk about things that happened years ago, or future goals, or plans to live in another country. So again, we can talk about things remote, displaced, removed in time and space. So this actually is a important cognitive development for the young child. And so the symbolic nature of language allows 4-year-old Sally, who already has the symbols and the rules in her brain, allows 4-year-old Sally on Monday to plan a trip to McDonald's on Saturday and then talk about a movie she saw last Sunday. Moving forward, let's now talk about productivity. I mentioned this in part 3 when we described the language rules, so this will be just a quick reminder for you. When we know the symbols, the speech sounds, and the words, so when we know the symbols and the rules of a language, we can be productive or creative with our language use. And that's our goal, right? To create completely novel, new sentences that have never been spoken before. This is our goal for the very young child as well. And sometimes young kids are not generative. They're not producing new creative utterances. And when it doesn't happen, we're aware of it and we become concerned as speech-language pathologists. So now I'll describe 4 more features or characteristics that are associated with our higher level cognition, with our intellect, that give even more evidence how human language and communication is so special and so different from animal communication. These are described for you on pages 19 to 20. So the first 4 higher level characteristics that reflect our cognition, recursion. This is our ability to create complex and grammatically embedded sentences, to understand and use figurative language, to engage in mental time travel, to self-reflect, to be spiritual, and to consider what others are thinking and feeling. This is just the last thing, to consider what others are thinking and feeling. We'll come back to this. This is referred to as theory of mind. Okay, so prevarication. This is our ability to create purposefully and intentionally linguistic messages that are false, that are deceptive, and that are meaningless. The third characteristic that's associated with our higher level thinking is reflexivity. This is also known as metalinguistic ability. This is our ability to use language to talk about it, to analyze it, to judge a sentence as either good or bad. And just as an aside, learning to read and write is a metalinguistic ability. And fourth is learnability. This is our ability to learn a second or a third language and includes our own motivation, cognition, and the environment. And lastly is traditional transmission, which means we are born to talk. As written on page 18, we have a genetic or biological capacity for language so powerful that few environmental factors can stop the acquisition of speech, although they may affect the rate at which language is acquired, and they may affect the quality of the language we use. So let's summarize what we've learned so far, and I think it's well summarized on page 20 in the book. The authors write, "We cannot help but be impressed by the spectacular differences that separate human communication from other systems in the animal kingdom, and that these differences contribute to the powerful creativity that drives human language." We are now at the end of Unit 1, Part 4. You should now be able to answer the following learning objectives for Part 4. You should be able to now explain these design features or characteristics that make human language and communication so special and different from animal communication. Semanticity and indexicality, displacement, productivity, recursion, prevarication, reflexivity, learnability, and traditional transmission.